President.
The senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, over the last few years, I've come to the floor many times to advocate for comprehensive tax reform. I share the belief that many in Congress, that tax reform is a necessary step to ensuring economic growth and prosperity in the future. That is why, as the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, I have made tax reform my top priority. We are now at a crossroads when it comes to tax reform. Before us are two alternative paths. The first path is the one we took back in 1986. It is the path that former House Democratic leader Dick Kephart and former Treasury Secretary James Baker advised members of the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee to take. And as you'll recall, they were two critical players in the last successful tax reform effort. And in 2011, at one of our hearings, they advised us to not mix deficit reduction and tax reform. This was a joint Senate Finance and Ways and Means Committee hearing. To paraphrase these two former leaders, each, is a hard enough task by itself, but doing them together is nearly impossible. So that is one path we can take. The path that separates our tax reform efforts from our deficit reduction efforts. In 2011, they both advised us not to mix deficit reduction and tax reform. They just basically said that each is a hard enough task by itself, but doing them together is nearly impossible. So that's one path we can take, the path that separates our tax reform efforts from our deficit reduction efforts. The other path we can take is to condition tax reform on the raising of additional revenues. Sadly, that seems to be the preferred path of many of my friends on the other side of the aisle. I'll never fully understand why, except their propensity to spend. According to many Democrats here in the Senate, there can be no deal on tax reform unless they get a second significant tax increase this year. Now, we heard just today from the Senate Democratic leadership that they want the Senate Finance Committee to use the Senate budget, which included nearly $1 trillion in tax hikes, as the model for tax reform. Essentially, what they're saying is that unless they get a big tax hike, we have to keep the tax system as it is, with all of its complexity, inequities, and distortions. Right now, this position is held by many on the other side of the aisle, and it's the biggest barrier to fundamental tax reform. Today, I'd like to take a few minutes to examine this position and to discuss the merits of conditioning tax reform on yet another significant tax increase. Last October, one of my friends on the other side put it this way, quote, "Tax reform 25 years ago was revenue neutral. It did not strive to cut the debt. Today, we can't afford for it not to. Our national debt today is approximately 73% of GDP. That's nearly double what it was in 1986, unquote." At first glance, this argument may appear to be reasonable. However, it falls apart under further examination. If my friends on the other side of the aisle were serious about deficit reduction, they would not focus their efforts on tax hikes. If they really wanted to get a handle on our nation's debt problems, they would work with Republicans to address the main drivers of our debt and deficits, our unsustainable entitlement programs. No one who has spent more than 5 minutes examining our nation's finances seriously disputes that the main drivers of our current debt and deficits and the source of the coming fiscal calamity are federal entitlement programs, especially our health care entitlements, Medicare and Medicaid. I have a chart from the Bipartisan Policy Center that tracks the trend lines on federal spending. As the chart shows, in the coming years, health care entitlement spending will overwhelm our federal fiscal picture and consume an outsized share of our economy. That is represented by the top blue line on the chart. All other categories of major federal spending either increase at significantly lesser rates or decline and stabilize. And as you can see, Social Security kind of levels off. Discretionary spending, we actually have made some, both defense and non-defense, we've seen that go down. other mandatory programs. As you can see, Mr. President, when it comes to deficit reduction and getting our debt under control, entitlement reform, that upper line that is going off the charts, is where the bodies are buried. Yet if you listen to my friends on the other side of the aisle, the problem is not our entitlement programs. The problem, they say, is that the American people simply aren't being taxed enough. Of course, the actual numbers tell a different story. Over the last 40 years, federal revenues as a percentage of the gross domestic product have averaged roughly 17.9%. While in recent years that number has decreased due to the struggling economy, tax revenues are on a pace to rise above the historic average and settle around 19% of GDP. Let me repeat that. Absent any changes in tax law, revenues are set to rise above historic levels relative to GDP, or the gross domestic product. So despite my friend's claims to the contrary, the root of our current fiscal crisis is not the lack of revenue, it is unsustainable spending. More specifically, it is entitlement spending. And that's just health care. That doesn't include some of the other. And that, Mr. President, is why all serious bipartisan deficit reduction discussions over the last few years have included structural reforms to our entitlement programs. Without significant changes, programs like Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security will remain unsustainable. In order to strengthen and preserve these programs for future generations, we need to reform them. If we don't reform them, we face a fiscal disaster. And it'll be a terrible disaster for all of our young people who are living today, who are going to have to foot this bill. All of the major discussions seeking to reach a so-called, quote, grand bargain, unquote, on deficit reduction have come down to a mix of different policies. But while they've all had different approaches, all of them have included structural entitlement reforms. When I talk about deficit reduction discussions, I'm referring to the Bowles-Simpson plan, the Domenici-Rivlin plan, the negotiations led by Vice President Biden, the G8 Senate talks, the negotiations between Speaker Boehner and President Obama, and the so-called super committee. Each of those grand bargain discussions divided deficit reduction policy issues into 4 categories. These categories are 1, discretionary spending, 2, non-health mandatory spending, 3, health care entitlement programs, and 4, revenue. These have been the agreed-upon areas of focus in our deficit reduction efforts. Yet if you listen to what my friends on the other side of the aisle have been saying recently, you'll see that their focus is entirely one-dimensional. We don't hear much talk anymore about addressing discretionary spending. We certainly don't hear much in terms of reining in entitlement spending. No, their only focus over here on the other side of the aisle is raising taxes. More precisely, their most recent argument has been that we've already cut so much spending over the last few years that we're now at a point where tax hikes are the only viable deficit reduction option. Now, of course, with the exception of the sequester cuts that took effect this year, we haven't really seen any real spending reductions as of yet, just promises which future Congresses can easily undo. Even though only a small portion of the promised spending cuts have actually taken place, my friends on the other side of the aisle like to claim that they've all already happened. Still, let's take a look at the record. Let's assume for a few minutes that all of the recently enacted deficit reduction is real, and take a closer look at what's been done with respect to deficit reduction categories I referred to earlier. In the last 2 years, 2 bills have been enacted with the purpose of major deficit reduction. The first was the Budget Control Act of 2011. The second was the Fiscal Cliff Deal, or the American Tax Relief Act of 2012. According to the Congressional Budget Office data, and consultation with the Senate Budget Committee, here's what's been done so far. The category that has been tapped the most is discretionary spending to the tune of $1.36 trillion of promised spending reductions over 10 years. Now remember, that's over 10 years. Once again, these are almost entirely promised spending cuts that have yet to be realized. If history has told us anything, it's that future promises to reduce spending aren't likely to be kept. Very unlikely to be kept. If you don't believe me, just look at the efforts by my friends on the other side of the aisle to undo even the small amount of spending cuts that are actually in place this year. Indeed, Democrats in Congress have been actively looking for ways to eliminate these cuts to discretionary spending, and if history is any indication, they may very well be successful in spite of the promises they made. Those who argue against these cuts typically do not want to merely provide greater flexibility over how the spending cuts occur. They don't want any cuts to occur, even though they are really only spending cuts relative to a bloated baseline that was supposed to be only temporarily elevated. Still, if you assume that against all odds these promised spending cuts remain in place, we will have reduced discretionary spending by $1.36 trillion relative to a baseline of bloated spending. The next highest deficit reduction category is revenues. Revenues have been increased by roughly $600 billion over 10 years. That was part of the fiscal cliff deal. This includes only the revenues generated by the fiscal cliff deal. It does not include the $1 trillion in new taxes enacted as part of Obamacare. Unlike the promised discretionary spending cuts I cited earlier, this revenue number is very real and not just promises. And while it may be a 10-year number that can theoretically be changed, history tells us that once tax hikes are in place, they always tend to stay there. So of the 4 deficit reduction categories, we've already taken significant steps with regard to promised discretionary spending reductions and actual revenue hikes. Where are we with the other categories? Like I said, healthcare entitlement spending is the biggest driver of future debts and deficits. No one who looks at this honestly, seriously disputes this. And the trust funds in Social Security, which are to finance retirement and disability payments, are on clear paths to exhaustion, with the Disability Insurance Trust Fund scheduled to dry up in 2016. Yet to date, very little of our deficit reduction attention has been focused on entitlement spending. So far, we've done absolutely nothing to deal with unsustainable Social Security promises, and we have done nothing to address insolvencies of the retirement and disability trust funds. And so far, we have reduced health care entitlements by a mere $81 billion over the next 10 years. That amounts to roughly 4% of overall promised deficit reduction we've enacted. That amount is minuscule relative to the amount of scheduled spending entitlements over the next 11 years. Take a look at this chart. That amount is the one on the right. You can just barely see the red line. That stands for $81 billion in entitlement cuts. But you look at that 10-year spending. As the chart behind me shows, over the next decade, we'll spend roughly $22 trillion on our 3 major entitlement programs. That's trillion with a T. Yet, as I just said, despite monumental claims about cutting spending and reducing deficits over the last couple of years, we've only been able to reduce entitlement spending by a mere $81 billion. Look at that little red line compared to the 10-year spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which is unsustainable. And yet nothing's being done by the majority. By the way, all of those spending reductions have come in the form of cuts to health care providers. They're cutting out doctors and hospitals and health care providers as if that's going to keep them on the job. A high percentage of doctors now are ready to retire and quit and find other ways of living. All of those spending reductions have come in the form of cuts to health care providers, not structural entitlement reforms. Once again, and they know that's not sustainable. Just that little bit is not sustainable. Once again, this approach is at odds with the grand bargain efforts we've seen over the last few years. All of those efforts, every single one of them, put structural entitlement reform on the table. Yet to date, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been unwilling to do the same. Like I said, my friends like to brag about all the promised deficit reduction they've enacted thus far, even the deficit reduction they're actively trying to repeal. But they've refused to even entertain a serious conversation about the main sources of our future debts and deficits. So, Mr. President, where are we? The Senate Finance Committee is engaged in a bipartisan effort to reform our nation's tax code and bring some sense of sanity to our nation's tax system. Chairman Baucus and I have asked our colleagues to assist us in this effort by sharing their views on what elements of the current tax code should be preserved. I want to thank my Republican colleagues on the Finance Committee for their input thus far. I have met with every one of them individually on this issue, except for one, and he is meeting with my staff, and I've really appreciated their thoughtful comments and advice. And while I remain hopeful that we'll be able to move on tax reform this year, I am disheartened by comments I've heard from my friends on the other side of the aisle. Indeed, many of my Democratic colleagues have stated that they're unwilling to engage in tax reform without assurances that it will have to include another massive tax increase. Once again, their message to the American people is that we have to keep the current system, which virtually everyone in the country agrees is a problem, unless the Republicans agree to higher taxes. They want to hold simplicity in the tax code hostage to demands for even more taxes. They want to hold efficiency in the economy, which stimulates growth and creates jobs, hostage to demands for the second tax hike of the year in order to pay for more of their spending and more of their expansion of government even further. They want to hold competitiveness of our businesses at home and around the globe hostage to demands that flow through businesses face yet another tax hike, even after having been hit already at the start of this year. My colleagues insist that their demands for higher taxes are all about deficit reduction. But let's face it, if deficit reduction were the real goal, entitlement reform would also be on the table. It would have to be on the table. After all, that is where the money is. That is where we have a chance to really reduce the deficit. That is where the future of our young people is going to be killed if we don't attack that problem now and do it in an intelligent way. But, Mr. President, entitlement reform is not on the table, according to my friends on the other side of the aisle. Despite the stated desire of President Obama and a number of congressional Democrats for a grand bargain on deficit reduction, when the rubber meets the road, they simply are not willing to engage in a real discussion about entitlement reform. Sure, they'll talk about cuts to providers and other cosmetic changes to these programs, and they'll talk about modifying cost of living adjustments in Social Security if they get hundreds of billions of dollars of new tax revenue in return. But at the end of the day, structural entitlement reforms simply aren't part of their deficit reduction equation. Despite many claims to the contrary, Republicans are willing to continue to engage, as they have in the past, in a bipartisan grand bargain for deficit reduction. Ask Senators Crapo, Coburn, and former Senator Gregg. They voted for Bowles-Simpson. Oddly enough, the remaining sitting Democratic senator who voted for Bowles-Simpson has walked away from the entitlement reform concessions he made and has instead focused on calls for more and more revenues. As a result, tax reform is being held hostage. Republicans and Democrats agree on the importance of tax reform. Our tax system is in dire need of reform. It is, quite frankly, one of the major obstacles standing between us and sustained economic growth. Most Democrats claim that they agree with this sentiment, but their desire for more revenues apparently trumps this belief in the need for tax reform. Something has to change, Mr. President. As I've said before, we've been counseled by some of our former leaders not to mix tax reform and deficit reduction. I think that's pretty good advice, and these were the two of the leaders who helped put through that 86 bill, both highly regarded by people on both sides of the aisle here in the Senate. Sadly, if the Democrats in Congress continue on their current course, neither tax reform nor deficit reduction will be possible. Indeed, if they continue to condition tax reform on additional tax hikes, and if they continue to refuse to engage in a real discussion about entitlement reform, very little is going to be accomplished on either front. Mr. President, this spending game has got to be over. We have got to start living within our means. We, on this side of the aisle, and I in particular, have seen every tax increase amount to more spending, not deficit reduction. So it's a phony argument. And that's what's going to happen if we're so dumb as to increase taxes in accordance with the comments of our leadership on the other side of the aisle just today. It's unbelievable that they get away with it. It's unbelievable after all these years that we have to put up with that type of argument when we know that they're not going to use that money for the appropriate reasons. And they never have. One of our senators told me the other day, he said, I just live for the day where we reform the tax code and it's not changed 4 years later by our friends on the other side of the aisle for the worse. The '86 bill was a good bill by any standard. It did a lot of good, but in about 4 years, our friends started to change it, and today we have the monstrosity that we call the United States tax code that nobody really believes in, and everybody knows is a detriment to our country. Mr. President, I'm really concerned. I think we're going to have some folks stand up on the other side of the aisle. We're willing to stand with them. We're willing to solve these problems in ways that will preserve the entitlement programs. They're not going to be preserved in their current form if we keep going the way we're going. And tax increases aren't the answer either. We are spending so much that it won't be long till we'll be in a category with like the next Greece if we don't watch it. And we've got to overcome this. Because there's no other entity in the world is going to bail us out. We have to bail ourselves out. We have to do it by doing what's right now, and by not increasing taxes. It means resolving these problems in a structural reform basis. And it's going to take good people on both sides of the aisle to do it, and I call on my friends on the other side to get with it, get real. Quit the tax charade. You know that's not going anywhere. And you also know that it's a phony thing to begin with. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.